the troops were integrated in Vietnam, but sometimes combat has a unifying effect on multi-ethnic combatants.
Sure it does. And it's also an incubator for all kinds of leftist social movements and other kinds of politics. I mean, I think that, well, and this is what's really compelling about Louis Beam as a writer. And when you teach this to undergraduates, this is the first thing that they notice, is that he's making a case for sort of the wrongness of war. War is a moral injury, both to the fabric of society and to himself and to his fellow soldiers. At one point, he thinks about, like, is the blood from this body bag a white man or a black man or a dead man? Like, war can even...
It's a body bag in his helicopter, right?
He's hauling. And he's hauling bodies, which is a very, very high exposure to all kinds of, fatigue and combat trauma and other concerns like that. But the thing is that he lays out that narrative, which we're all very familiar with, and then in the last few paragraphs pivots around to calling for ensuring the future of white children and worrying about the annihilation of the race and the conspiracy of internationalist forces that's trying to control the country and how things are lost and things like this. So he's both utilizing the Vietnam War narrative and sort of providing this a way to attach that to reactions to the social movements that had really reshaped the country in the prior years.
And as a matter of fact, I gather that often in Vietnam, racial relations among American soldiers were fraught. Not always, but there was tension. I mean, this was the late 60s. Right. You had, a lot of ferment in the black community in the United States. You had the Black Panthers, the Black Power movement, blah, blah, blah. And so there was some absence of harmony often, I gather.
Yeah, I mean, everything from, so we can think of it as Vietnam was the first real test of the integrated army, and certainly they hadn't worked it all out yet. The sources document everything from people hanging Confederate flags in their hooch to race riots on posts and bases in the United States and at base camps in Vietnam. And then on top of all of that, there's also racial strife between, of course, the soldiers and the Vietnamese combatants and Vietnamese citizens that they're there purportedly to protect, but actually often had a very violent interaction with in ways that have been documented by other scholars.
Yeah, and in fact, the movement, the White Power movement, had a very pronounced, anti-communist dimension of its ideology, right? And I guess I'm not totally clear. I mean, some of that must have preceded Vietnam. I mean, there is a connection with the John Birch Society. There is a little bit of a lineage there, right? Going back before Vietnam.
Yeah.
But I gather that the war somehow, even though in some ways they weren't happy about being thrown into a war against communists, the enmity with communists really stuck in a big way, right?
Well, I think two things. Yes, that's a continuation of Vietnam War rhetoric that was very useful for the movement, but it's also an example of how the White Power movement was still drawing on strategy from the Ku Klux Klan, especially earlier in the 20th century. So if you look at the second era of the Klan, which is the largest Klan membership moment in the 1920s, we're talking about around 4 million people. And that's the Klan that was very much part of sort of a public club culture and did a lot of parading in public, women's and children's auxiliary activities. There are famous pictures of them marching on the mall in Washington, D.C. with robes and hoods, but no mask. So it's a much more public-facing Klan. Mm-hmm. That Klan is a really good example of how history can show us what white power was doing by using communism. Mm-hmm. So the 20s Klan we think of was anti-Black, right? Classically anti-Black in the South. And it was anti-Black everywhere. But on the U.S.-Mexico border, it was anti-Mexican. In the Pacific Northwest, where there was a lot of union activity, it was anti-labor. In the Northeast, where there was a lot of immigrants, it was anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic. And also anti-Catholic in Indiana because of Notre Dame. And there's a bunch of interactions there. So the Klan was ready to be, it's classically anti-Black and anti-Semitic, but it was also prepared to be anti-communist when that was a more fruitful recruitment pitch, and also there was less public opposition to anti-communist violence than than racist violence.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned that the Klan had been, I guess, anti-Mexican on the border, if I got that right. One of the early post-Vietnam manifestations of the white power movement involved immigrants, and in fact, immigrants from Vietnam. And this really struck me because of the current context, where a certain amount of the I think, the activity of people you'd call part of the white power movement, at least loosely, involves immigrants. And there was a big that was a big deal. It was these Vietnamese fishermen, right?
Right. So what happened is Louis Beam, after he returned, purchased land to create a paramilitary training camp near Anahuac, Texas. He actually used the Texas Veterans Land Grant to make that purchase. So he was using a veterans benefit to create a paramilitary training apparatus to bring the war home, quite literally. And what happened is, in a nearby series of fishing communities, there was this large influx of Vietnamese refugee families who had self-located to the area because they knew the climate, they knew how to do crab and shrimp fishing. They pooled their resources, they bought boats, often at dramatically inflated prices, and then they began fishing. And these refugees often lived with a communal lifestyle, eating only what they caught in the bay, living many people to one trailer, and were able to sort of like outfish the local fishermen with their lifestyle in many ways.
So there was that same the kind of competition you see, a perceived competition for jobs, basically.
Yeah, I mean, this was a legit competition for jobs in that in order for the white fishermen in this community to compete, they would have really had to take a huge lifestyle cut. And there were also problems with overfishing as a result of the population resettlement. But yes, we saw in this incident, there was a huge focus on this by a Klan and sort of early white power groups. The Klan came in and trained the white fishermen who were upset in the paramilitary camp and got them rallying and parading and harassing the Vietnamese refugees. And what ended up happening is that the refugees came together with the Southern Poverty Law Center, filed a civil suit, and got a stop granted to parading in public with firearms, which was against the law at Texas at the time, and I believe still is, although I see pictures that seem to indicate otherwise. But they got to stop. They stopped the Klan harassment, and Louis Beam even relocated to Idaho for a while. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that incident is a really interesting one. It's sort of a classic. A lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric from earlier in the 20th century showed up in the white power publications about this series of events. So it's a moment where we see a lot of sort of historical threads coming together.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and you just mentioned these paramilitary camps.
Yeah.
One thing that surprised me in listening to the book was how many different such camps there have been in the United States. I mean, as I said, this kind of hit my radar screen right after the McVeigh bombing, when you started hearing about these militias. And even then, they sounded like sometimes they were kind of itinerant, and there wasn't necessarily a single camp. It was just guys that find a place to get together on the weekend. But I gather there were what you could call paramilitary camps at various places in the United States, certainly in the South. Yeah. Later in the West and the Northwest, right?
Yeah, and I suspect that there was one in Pennsylvania, although I haven't been able to figure that. I haven't run that lead all the way down. They were across the country. People traveled to these camps from all over. People traveled between the camps, and at the camps, some of them were weakened in the sense that they had periods of activity and inactivity, but they were by no means sort of like hobby camps. They were outfitted with very sophisticated weapons and material. People trained in everything from, nuclear attack, response first aid and things like this, to urban warfare and sniper shooting and things like that. They had things like anti-tank weapons, and they made their own claymore mines. These are not low-tech things.
Yeah.
Well, let me put it this way. It's not just a bunch of people getting together to do something for fun on the weekend. It's
Right.
a serious training apparatus.
And some of them had the explicit plan of like what? Like overthrowing the government or throwing the government into chaos or...
Well, so, and this might be the trickiest thing to understand about this whole movement is how could a small fringe group of people with, something like 25,000 hardcore activists only, how could they think that they could win against the United States, which is this huge militarized super state in the late 20th century? How could they possibly pull that off? And I think there we have to turn again, well, to a different kind of archive. There's this book, The Turner Diaries, which is it's sort of set up as a dystopian fiction piece about a white revolution that successfully overthrows the government and then creates first a white nation and then a white world. But it really became the playbook of this movement. Hundreds of thousands of copies circulated through the movement. They turned up everywhere. I mean, Timothy McVeigh, I think, had one either in his trunk or on his person at the time of the bombing. I should check that. But he had it. He'd read it and he referenced it. They kept a stack of 20 of them at the bunkhouse for the Order, which was a paramilitary terrorist group in the Northwest. They distributed them for free at a Klan and a white power training paramilitary camp in North Carolina. This book was every place. And what it shows is that acts like the Oklahoma City bombing were never meant to be the end point of what they were doing. What it was supposed to do was awaken the people. Mm-hmm. These acts were supposed to work like guerrilla warfare. They were supposed to wake people up to the corruption of what they thought of as the system, which was for this movement either the Zionist occupational government, which was thought of as a conspiracy of Jewish and internationalist forces.
So when you see the letter Zog on right-wing websites, that's what that refers to.
That's what that is. The idea is that there are secretly Jews and other people in control of the U.S. government, the banks, the United Nations, et cetera, and that all of that then controls the media and other institutions of our society.
And that goes back pretty far. I mean, certainly the anti-Semitism goes back to the original Klan.
Yeah. I mean, this is you would trace that back to Protocols of the Elders of Zion and things like that. Zog in the movement eventually sort of loses popularity and gets replaced with their idea of the New World Order, which is not the same New World Order that you hear in, say, George Bush speeches. Although,
did they get it from him? So George W. Bush, the original, the first President Bush, gave this speech where he talked about a New World Order, and it was after that I remember it showing up in right-wing sites as this threat. It was like this was part of the New World Order was the thing that the black helicopters were going to, it was part of the menacing United Nations that was going to send the black helicopters into your backyard. And by the way, I mean, consistent with your thesis about how kind of in a way diffuse and hard to pin down this is, that kind of rhetoric you saw in just like on Pat Robertson's channel, I think. Yeah, I mean, I don't mean the Zog part, but the New World Order part.
He did a book called The New World Order.
Yeah, okay, there you go. So just in right-wing Christian circles not thought of, and maybe they didn't think of themselves as part of the white power movement, but they were, they were promulgating some of the memes that were also being embraced.
Yeah, memes is actually a really good way to think about this because bits of this ideology were very portable and very attractive. And I think that part of the way that white power worked was to bring people in through a common idea that they could get behind, like the Vietnam War story or the New World Order, or the apocalypse, actually, for evangelicals also.
Right.
And use that as a recruitment tactic to bring people farther into the movement. So if you think about, as I said, this is a fringe movement. So at its largest point, we're talking about perhaps 5 million in the militia movement, including members and sympathizers. That is the highest estimate I've ever seen. And I think that that's probably, that, as I said, that would include a lot of people who are not white power activists. And I think it's probably a little high. But I do think that we can trace sort of concentric circles of movement activity. So in the 80s, for instance, we're talking about 25,000 hardcore activists. Those are people who live and breathe the movement, people who marry other people in the movement. Their childcare and their schools are within the movement. Their jobs are arranged by people in the movement often. and all their friends are, full time, they're in this movement.
Mm-hmm.
And then outside of that, there is like 125 to 150,000 people who aren't quite so hardcore as that, but will buy the literature, go to a rally, go to public events, go to a cross burning, things like that. Outside of that, there's another 450,000 people who would not themselves buy the literature, but who would read the literature. And you can imagine that this goes on and includes sort of this diffusion of belief.
Yeah, and it includes, somewhere on the periphery, it includes things that I remember, like Soldier of Fortune magazine, which you talk about, which I had thought of as just this kind of like hyper macho, like these guys who imagine being mercenaries, they have guns, they like guns, but it had a sometimes close to explicit political dimension, right?
Absolutely. Well, so and one of the interesting things is that similarly, Soldier of Fortune is not a white power publication and was not at the time of my study, but it did sort of enable white power activity. So, the camo fatigues worn by the order were purchased at a Soldier of Fortune convention. Timothy McVeigh and Soldier of Fortune went to the same gun shows, right? So there is sort of like a shared paramilitary circuitry of connection. But it's also like, Soldier of Fortune referred to a whole lot of armchair warriors on the outside of this circle, and then to some people who might one day go to a paramilitary training camp for fun. And then in the center, a smaller group of survivalists, actual mercenaries, white power readership, etc. So I think the way that these things, can diffuse is part of how you find those points of connection with the mainstream. Mm-hmm. The other thing about sort of the idea of the New World Order. Well, first of all, just that I think Zog slides pretty easily into the New World Order. I think those two terms do the same thing within the movement rhetoric.
So New World Order was like code for Jewish conspiracy to run the world, basically?
Or internationalist conspiracy.
Yeah. Not the way George Bush, that's not what George Bush meant, but the way...
No, within this movement. But it's the idea, it's the idea that there is a malevolent conspiracy that runs the world and has to be resisted through guerrilla warfare and revolution is the distillation at the center of that concentric circle. The other thing is that I think it's really important to think about the meaning of the end of the world within that narrative. That's where Pat Robertson and evangelical belief can come into the same what's the best way to think about this? That's where those belief systems touch. Except that evangelicals, who are also increasingly apocalyptic in the 1980s and who have rising numbers quite dramatically across the 80s, have a doctrine of rapture, which is the idea that there's going to be this moment where they will be peacefully transported out of the world and up to heaven before the time of tribulations, which is before the return of Christ. The people that I write about who believed in a Christian end of days are Christian identity or two-seed proponents. Mm-hmm. And that sect did not have an idea of rapture. They believed that they would be on earth during the period of tribulation. They had to outlast the tribulations before Christ could return. And a lot of them also believed that they were supposed to be the army of God who cleared the world of the unfaithful before Christ could come back. And in Christian identity theology, the unfaithful are, and the non-human is everybody non-white, including people of color and Jews who are talked about as being descended from animals or from Satan, depending on the doctrine. And then all of the traitors, right? There's a lot of traitors in this ideology. All of those people they thought would need to be cleared from the earth before, before Christ could return. That is a powerful, powerful thing. So some people responded to that just by becoming survivalists, stockpiling food, learning how to make soap, stockpiling weapons. But other people really thought that they would be the soldiers. And for that belief, you had to really, I just think it's a very powerful ideology.
Mm-hmm. And I gather that in the earlier phase, like right after Vietnam, as compared to, say, now in the last 10 years, a lot of the people in the white power movement did identify strongly as Christian. Now you think of skinheads, neo-Nazis, I have no idea if Richard Spencer's a Christian. Maybe he is, and I should know that. But we don't think today of Christianity, of Christian identity as being as central to the movement as it was right after Vietnam. Like Louis Beam considered himself a very good Christian, right?
Yeah. Well, Beam was very devout. I think, well, that's one of the things that I'm not sure we know the answer to yet, because I think a lot of kind of the level, I think a lot of the level of the importance of religion within a social movement is actually found in the archive of women's action, because women tend to be the people who are often are brokering social relationships, paving over differences, but also are necessary for the kinds of relationships that can be framed through religion. So in my archive, there's actually a huge, a trove of people who married within the movement, took care of each other's children within the movement. It's everything from rides to the airport to marriage counseling. And a lot of that was through Christian Identity Church. So that's one of the places where I think history can show us what might be happening, but I wouldn't really be able to speculate on relative importance of faith within the movement without an archive.
Okay. So then during the 80s, I mean, there's a number of incidents that like I had kind of half forgotten, but now, you know, when you mention them in the book, they spring to mind, like the murder of Alan Berg, the disc jockey in Denver who had confronted some of these people on the radio. And then a couple of other things. And then there's Timothy McVeigh, the big thing.
Yeah.
And as you note, it's the biggest, until 9/11, it was the biggest thing since Pearl Harbor in terms of number of Americans in America killed by a violent attack, right?
Yeah, it's the largest deliberate mass casualty between Pearl Harbor and 9/11. I think the reason that we've forgotten about a lot of these things, or the reason that they haven't, I mean, forgotten is not the right word exactly, because as you say, you remember them when they happened, right? But we didn't have the narrative frame to put them together and make sense of what it was. And I think that frame is really important for a lot of different reasons. But mostly because what it shows us is how much this was a social movement, which means that when we talk about these events and understand acts of violence, we're not talking about a lone wolf or a single action or, one shooting, the assassination of one person, which is how that event is usually narrated. It's part of this large social movement that has an ideology behind it and that's connected to many other acts of violence. It's interesting because all of the events I write about in this book were reported at the time of their occurrence. There was footage of the paramilitary camps in Galveston on morning news shows. They were covered in the New York Times, the Christian Science Monitor, and local papers. There were a bunch of really great local reporters who got in depth into one part of this. So there was a record when it happened. The Greensboro shooting was even a Saturday Night Live sketch. But somehow in the interim, we've ended up with
remind us, the Greensboro shooting is...
that was the shooting in 1979 of 5 leftist demonstrators by a neo-Nazi and Klan gunman.
Okay.
And that one was captured on 2 different news cameras, and everyone was still acquitted in state and federal trials, and only partial justice was rendered in the civil trial. But I think what happened is that there was a large seditious conspiracy trial in 1987-88 in Fort Smith, Arkansas, that became deeply embarrassing for the government because all of the white power activists tried were acquitted, despite demonstrable seditious conspiracy that they talked about and wrote about and were carrying out.
Including Louis Beam, right?
Including Beam, yeah. That trial was of dubious partiality, shall we say. So things happened like 2 defendants had romantic relationships with jurors.
That's one of the warning signs. If you're the the partiality watchdog, I'd say that should get the meter going a little. Yeah.
Another juror, besides those ones, said that they thought race mixing was prohibited by the Bible. Tons of evidence was excluded, including evidence that showed that Beam was tied to the order. So it was a problem trial. that trial afterwards, my colleague Leonard Zeskin found that an FBI document had actually set out the policy of, we're not going to try this movement anymore. We're going to go for individuals. We're not going to try to do this as a movement because it doesn't work. And I think that this Sedition trial, plus, the huge public relations disasters that were also great tragedies at Ruby Ridge and Waco, meant that by the time we got to the Oklahoma City bombing, there wasn't even an investigation of whether there was a movement behind Timothy McVeigh.
And for people who don't remember quickly, I mean, the Waco was this, well, first of all, Ruby Ridge was a tax evader who had an ideological connection, I would say, with the white power movement, right?